is where this cell is not active, and everywhere it's sort of reddy yellow is where this cell is active. So we can see this grid cell at the top is active whenever the rat is at sort of locations that lie on this triangular grid. It's quite remarkable. Whereas these hippocampal place cells, whenever the cell is active where just at sort of one location in space. But more recently, there's been a whole heap of other cells found which also care about space. So not just these grid cells and place cells, you get things like object vector cells. So here's a cell that cares about a vectorial relationship to every object, this white object in the environment. So here there are 6 objects in the environment, and it always fires to the northwest of that object. And here's another cell which always fires just to the west of that object. And you also in the entorhinal cortex get these things like border cells, cells that really care about borders. And then if you look down in hippocampus, you get other cells that look a lot like these object vector cells, but they don't respond to every object in the environment. You know, they do not generalize to every object. So it's sort of been seen that each of these cells is their own sort of beast, and a beast in their own right. And you know, all ended up with a Nature paper, and you know, they're sort of seen as separate entities. But what we're going to try and argue is that they are perhaps all come out of the same framework of relational abstraction and relational inferences. Okay, anyway, away from space, it's been demonstrated that humans and animals perform all sorts of other relational inferences, and they crucially rely on the hippocampal formation as well. For example, a very famous one done by Howard Eichenbaum is the notion of transitive inference. So here, if I preferentially reward to an animal A over B, and separately if I preferentially reward B over C, and separately if I do C over D, and separately D over E. So the animal's only ever seen these pairwise rewards, pairwise choices, and then it, you know, it discovers that A is better than B, and C is better than D, and so on, but it's only ever seen those adjacent pairs. If I then come along and ask it, what would you prefer, B or D, even though it's never seen that choice before, it will make the inference to choose B, because even though it's only ever seen pairs, the animal is able to chain together all of those events to lie along a line. Likewise, if I came and told you that Jane, if they had a fight with Bob, would beat up Bob, and likewise Bob would beat up Alice, and Alice would beat up Gina, and so on. If I then asked you, who do you think would win a fight, Jane or Gina, you might say Jane, even though you've never actually seen them fight before, but you have seen a sort of a line of, or you have seen sort of events which lie on a line, and you can chain them together. So this is a notion of making these immediate inferences based on sparse observations, but you're able to make these inferences because they've chained it together on a line relational structure. So what Howard and colleagues showed is that these sorts of inferences are crucially dependent on the hippocampal formation. For example, if you lesion bits of the inputs of the hippocampus, you'll discover that animals are no longer able to make these sort of long-range relational inferences of things they've never seen. But if you still ask them just the pairwise relationships that they have already seen before, they will still be able to correctly answer them. So they can remember the individual events, but they cannot chain things together. And that was done in these sort of line-like transitive inferences. There's also been other sorts of studies done on sort of social relationships and social hierarchies, which in fMRI studies have been shown to activate in the hippocampal areas of the hippocampal formation. Okay, so we've got here, so I just described some sort of spatial cells and these sort of you know, other bits of the hippocampal formation that seem to do relational inferences. Also, real curiosity is that very recently it's been discovered those sort of spatial cells that I described, the sort of place cells that cared about space, seem to also care about non-spatial problems. For example, an animal holding down a lever, pressing down a lever until it hears a certain sound frequency is inherently a very, very non-spatial task to do. However, if you look inside the hippocampus, you'll find these sort of cells that seem to tile the space as if, so one cell here seems to care about just this sound frequency and not other ones. And likewise, this cell here seems to care about these sound frequencies and not other ones. So they seem to have care about a place in frequency space as opposed to a place in actual space. And likewise, you seem to get these sort of multi-peak cells, which might be attributed to sort of grid-like cells, linear grid-like cells. Perhaps this is not so surprising because, as we know, sound frequency lies on a one-dimensional track. So it's almost like a slice through a two-dimensional space. And interestingly, about a third of these cells, which care about sound frequency, also really also are active or are actually place cells in spatial problems. And then again, we've shown things that, in the sound frequencies, this is a one-dimensional thing here. But if we then look in two-dimensional non-spatial spaces, so here participants will navigate around, they'll just see a bird on their screen, and that bird, as they move their joystick, will change its leg length and neck length. So again, a non-spatial problem, but mapped by 2 dimensions. If you go and look inside their brain using fMRI, you will find these characteristic 6-fold oscillations characteristic to grid cells, and you'll find them in medial entorhinal cortex, where grid cells are normally found. So these sort of results really seem to point to the notion of, perhaps there is this common mechanism, a common framework that underpins both spatial and non-spatial problems in the same way. Okay, so this sort of raises a few natural questions. The first one is, how on earth does this relational inference work? And then how can the same system solve both spatial and non-spatial problems? And lastly, why do all these cells that we just looked at, those spatial cells we looked at before, why do they look like how they do look? Okay, and so to begin along this quest, we're going to really try to think about what is actually the structure of this problem that the brain is trying to solve. What is this sort of relational problem of relational structural inference? Okay, so this is the kind of problem that we want to understand. If I come along and tell you that Alice is the child of Janice and Bob is the brother of Janice, even though I've only told you those 2 bits of information, you're able to fill in an awful lot more. You know, for example, that Bob is now the uncle of Alice. Even though I only told you 2 things, you now know 6 things about this situation. And you're able to do that because you sort of know what a family is. But of course, yes, of course, and you know what a family is, and you know how these sort of relationships add up to mean the same thing. You know that parent plus brother is the same as uncle. It's almost like path integration, adding up actions, and but more for these sort of arbitrary spaces. It doesn't just have to be about spatial space, 2D space. But of course, that's not the only thing that this sort of that we care about. We don't just care about one family, we care about many families. And what we want to do is we want to abstract away this notion of relationships and structure and apply that to new situations. We want to generalize that knowledge to new scenarios. So now when I encounter, oh crikey, now when I encounter this new family, I can immediately also know what's going on because I've learned about this sort of abstraction from different families. And of course, exactly this is going to be true in spatial problems. Only now, rather than having the sort of graph-like structure that was a family tree graph, we can have these sort of graph-like structures that obey the rules of 2-dimensional space. For example, this 2D graph here. And here, path integration has a much more familiar meaning, such that if I go north, east, south, and west, I'm back in the same place. And so this is really the sort of very simple and almost overly trivial framework to try to think about how we might bind together spatial problems such as this one with these more sort of more classical problems of relational inference that I showed from Howard-Eichenbaum earlier. Okay, and this is going to bring us towards defining this model that we have called the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine. And this is a machine for learning and generalizing abstract relational knowledge. So I'll warn you now, it's less of a warning, but I'm not really going to go into the big nitty-gritty details of the neural networks and everything that's going on. Feel free to ask me at any point if you want to hear those details. But what I'm going to try and do is really offer an intuition for what's going on, to really describe like what are the basic computations of how this machine works. And I'll try to do that in several different ways. So hopefully at the end of it, one of those ways will speak to you. Okay, so what's the problem statement? I'm going to say, right, I'm going to give you a stream of sensory stimuli and relationships. So you've got a lot of these sensory stimuli, light bulb, broom, motorbike, car, book, sorry. And I'm also going to give you a lot of these relationships, you know, right, down, right, etc. And I'm going to give you a whole stream, and then I'm going to ask you what comes next. Now that sounds like a pretty impossible task, but it becomes an awful lot easier because you've seen many of these sort of similar worlds before, and you've, so, sorry, what I mean to say is that you've seen many of these streams of sensory stimuli and relationships having been derived from similar worlds before. This model will never have actually seen this graph-like structure. Again, it will only ever see sequences derived from the graph structure. It will never actually know there is a graph structure, but its job is to be able to abstract away from that stream of sensory observations, abstract away that there is some underlying structure. That's its job. It's going to have to try and learn that there is some underlying structure. So if you are able to learn there's some underlying structure, it really, really helps you on this prediction problem, because now I can get my stream and I can take each action, and I know what an action now means. It means that I'm going to move around, I'm going to path integrate and follow this path around such that now when I get to this banana and I'm told I'm going to take an up signal, I will be able to know that a light bulb's coming there. Because I'm able to sort of, one, remember the light bulb, but also remember, also to realize that I'm back in the same place. But to know that I'm back in the same place, I really need to understand that this sequence actually lies on this square grid. Okay. So this is what the problem is, really. We really need to learn in some way, have some internal representation of the relational structure of the problem, exactly like the cognitive map of Tolman that we described earlier. They need to have some internal representation of this abstract structure, how things relate to each other, but how they relate in some abstract manner, not tied to any one particular family in this case. And then when I come along and observe a new family, all I need to do is sort of have a memory and place each person at each point in the graph. And so this is the example of the family of Tim Behrens. We can see that Tim and his wife go at the top, and then his two children will be placed together in the sort of children nodes. And so that's really the two components here. We need one that is able to represent abstractions and relational structure, and another component of relational memory that can bind new observations to this abstract structure. And again, similarly in space, if you want to be able to predict you're going to see the motorbike after going for a right, down, a left, and an up, you need, one, you need to remember that you haven't seen a motorbike before, and two, you need to know that east, south, west, and north equals 0. You need to be able to know the relational structure, and you need to remember things. Okay, so there's going to be the two problems that we're going to try and solve together. And just to like reiterate what this task structure is, the model is going to see the model is going to see streams of sensory observations and actions. Oh, crikey. That's all it will see. It is, however, me, the experimenter, and you now seeing this, we know that these sequences have been derived from this graph, but this graph will never actually be shown to the model itself. And then that's going to happen in lots and lots of different environments of different sizes. In fact, the sizes will be much bigger than these ones. This is just schematics. And it's important that we do it in lots of different sizes because we really want the model to know about the abstraction of what it is, the fundamental rules of the space, i.e. there's 4 connections, and not just learn a template of the space. Okay, so how do we start thinking about this problem? I'm going to try to think about by writing down the generative model of the problem that we're trying to solve. And I'm going to sort of go through this bit. It doesn't matter if you haven't seen generative models or anything before, because I'll hopefully explain it in a more intuitive way afterwards as well. Okay, so generative models normally look a bit like something like this. They have these sort of variables that are connected to each other somehow. And in our problem, it's going to be something along the lines of, where am I in my abstraction? And we're going to sort of try to generate what I actually see. Okay, so let's think about that a bit more. Okay, so we might start with believing that we have some representation G, which believes that we're at this location in this structure. And then we're going to be like, right, I've got some abstraction of where I think I am. And then I'm going to be like, what does that actually mean in my current world? So I'm tying together both where I am in my extraction and current sensory observations. And then from that, I can predict, right, I should see a motorbike. But of course, I can then provide an action, some sort of relationship, and I can transition to a new location. So here I got the down action. I'm transitioning to some new location in this abstraction. And then I can do exactly the same process. Where was I last time? What am I about to see? The important thing here is this stuff at the top, these sort of notions of the abstraction which don't care about any one particular world. That's rather useful because it means it generalizes to any world which has the same sort of four-way connected space that we've, four-way connected structure. So these things care about all worlds, and these things down the bottom just care about for the particular world that I'm in right now. That's a bit of a question, this whole notion of what was there last time. What does that really mean? Well, as we said earlier, to know what was there last time, we really need a memory. And that's going to be indicated by these square boxes here. Sort of an accumulation of all the memories of what have I seen in what location from the previous steps that I've taken in this environment. Okay, so that's putting it all together as this sort of overall generative model. But I'll continue to hopefully explain this in more intuition in a moment. Okay, so but there's real questions and things I haven't said in any way. It's one, how on earth are we doing these memories? What does it really mean to have this memory in this model? And the second thing, that's all very well, but we've got a generative model. But what we care about in generative models is not about the generative model. We care about how do we infer things, i.e. how do I see some observations and work out where I am, and work out what memory should I form. So that's what we're going to try and solve, and we're going to try and solve them together in the next few slides. Okay, so let's start with the memory because it's sort of the easy bit to do. So I'm going to try and do these sort of memories a little bit like how people believe they do memories in the brain. So what people think is you take some sensory representation, here it's some sensory representation of a motorbike, and you can feed that into a network, and then you can upweight weights between coactive neurons. So here, and those weights themselves will encode that memory. They will store that memory. And this is sort of auto-associative Hebbian learning. So if you've done that, it means you can come along and provide a partial sensory input, so an incomplete sensory input, and you can input that into the same network, and then via attractor dynamics, you should be able to retrieve the full pattern. So that's sort of how memory in some way is at least believed to take place in the hippocampus. You encode memories of Hebbian learning and you complete with pattern completion. But of course, that's not quite what we want, because we're not ever going to be providing sensory input. We want to be able to predict what we're going to see based on where we are. So inputting partial sensory stuff isn't really what we want. But we can play a trick. And let's just think about what that trick's going to be. So it's going to be that we want this motorbike, and so let's say we see a motorbike and we believe we're at this X location B. What we really want to then make a memory of is this motorbike at that location. So how might we do that? Well, we know sort of how to represent a motorbike. That's just some sensory signal. And let's imagine for a moment that we know how to represent our location in this relational structure. That's going to be by this blue thing, and sensory by the red thing. If we make our memories conjunctive, I make this memory know both information about where we are and what we are seeing, that's really going to help us. And here, these cells are only going to fire if, so a cell here will only fire if it gets appropriate input from the structure stuff and appropriate input from the sensory things. Why might that help us? Because if you remember, I said something about these attractor dynamics can allow completion of memories from partial sensory stuff or partial inputs. The trick is now we can complete our relational memories from a partial input, but where that partial input is just based on our belief in our abstract location alone. So now this is this G bit, so we can put in our G, input into our attractor network, and then complete our memory by these attractor dynamics and all the stored weights and so on. And then from that, we can retrieve our sensory representation. So that's basically the sort of flow of this generative model. These M's are going to be the weights in between these cells. The G's are the blue bits. The P's are the, well, what ends up being these red and blue bits. And the X is the red bits. Okay, so we can retrieve what from where, but because we can do things in exactly the same way and run it the reverse as well, we can retrieve where from what. We can input a sensory representation, then retrieve a memory from attractor dynamics, and then retrieve some belief of where we are. So we can have, run it both ways. Okay, so that's how we're going to do memories, these conjunctions, and those conjunctions are going to allow us to be able to predict what we're seeing, essentially. Okay, let's put it together. Right, so we're going to have a generative model which has some belief of where we are. We can make transitions to a new belief from where we are, and then we can retrieve memories and predict what we're seeing. We're going to essentially have an inference model which takes sensory observations and the previous belief of where we are, and then infers a new belief of where we are, and then also forms a memory. For those people who might be familiar with, more familiar with Bayesian techniques and Helmholtz machines and variational autoencoders, that's how we're going to do. We're going to have these two models running in parallel, and they're going to train each other. They're going to train all the weights in the neural network and sort of fight each other until they're both happy with what's going on. Okay, so that was the memories bit done, but how on earth do we actually learn these transitions? How do we actually learn a map of the abstract space? How do we learn this cognitive map? Okay, so again, let's believe that we're at this location E, I think, and that we're going to have some belief that we've got some belief of where we are. And that's this current blue representation. What we're going to do is we're going to get some signal, some relationship or some action which says go to uncle. And what we're going to do is we're going to transition this representation, this belief of where we are, into some new belief in where we are. And these are really the important weights. These are going to be the weights of the neural network that we really care about, because those weights are essentially going to encode the relationships of the overall, the relational structure of the overall space. Because they're the ones going to allow us to transition around and path integrate around. Okay, and then once we have a belief of where we are, we can then again retrieve the memory and make some prediction. Okay, but now we've made this prediction, we can then compare it to what was really there, what we actually then observed. And of course, in this case, we've observed a chair and we predicted a chair, and that's great, we were right. But if we were wrong, that would be really also a good thing, because then we can use the errors in how we are wrong to essentially backpropagate through this whole network. And this network will be many, many steps long. It'll backpropagate through, and it'll update these weights such that the next time if it saw the whole same things again, it would be more likely to predict the chair, more likely to be correct. So this sort of error signals that we're getting here is a way of, or prediction error signals that we're getting, is going to be a way of training our network and training these weights such that it learns the relational structure of the space. Okay, and then if you're a little bit more fiddly about how you do Bayes and so on, there are a few more errors. The errors that I just described here are the prediction error, the sensory prediction errors. And there's going to be another error which says, right, is my predicted memory the same as my inferred memory? And there's another error signal that says, right, is my predicted belief in where I am in this abstract space the same as where I infer where I am in this abstract space? And together, these errors are going to be the ones that are going to help train this model. Okay, do ask any questions if you have any. I understand that was hopefully it adds some intuition, but it's not going to satisfy any deep people who want to see maths and so on. So do ask questions. I'll just continue anyway. Right. Okay, so does this whole thing work? Well, let's just recap again quickly on what the problem is. We've got a stream of sensory stimuli and relationships, and we're trying to try and predict what's coming next. And do just Google Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, and there's a preprint online as well, which says this all in more details. Okay, so if it works, if this machine, the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine, TEM, is able to learn an abstraction of the space, it should be able to do things like this. it should be able to take this tortuous path or be shown a sequence of stimuli along this tortuous path, the red one going all the way around, which covers all of the nodes in this graph. And then it should actually know everything about that graph now. It should know all of the other relationships because it should have learned the backbone structure. It should be able to place this path on their relevant nodes. So now if I come along and ask it what's to the northeast of the orange, it should be able to tell me a bed, even though it's never actually seen this relationship before. But because it's seen all of the nodes, it should be okay. So in other words, it's saying that the performance of this machine should be in line with the number of nodes it has seen in the environment and not the number of edges. And that's exactly what we find. So gray is the performance of TEM, and it tracks exactly the number of edges and not the number of, track the number of nodes and not the number of edges. Okay, so let's see how it works on these sort of relational inferences like tasks. So here's going to be a transitive inference one. Maybe you can see that A is better than B, and B is better than C, and C is better than D. And then we'll ask it questions like, what would you prefer, A or D, or A or B or D, and so on. Okay, so right at the very, what we're showing is, so here is the, was I able to predict correctly on the y-axis, or the, was I able to predict correctly? And on the x-axis is how many times I had visited that node before. So you can see when I visited a node never before, it's not going to be able to predict correctly. But when it's visited it once, it should be able to, if it understands what's going on, it should be able to work. Okay, so the stuff in blue at the bottom is when this machine has only ever seen this linear structure once before. It hasn't learned about the structure at all, and it's kind of a bit rubbish. But then after it's seen 20 or so together, it gets a little bit better at making these one-shot inferences. And then the more and more it sees, it gets better and better and better at making these immediate inferences. And that is because it has learned the underlying structure of what it is to be on a line. And likewise, in these more family hierarchical-based graphs, again, at the very, very beginning, when it's only ever seen one family tree before, it's rubbish. It can't make these inferences. But right at the end, it can make a one-shot immediate inference of what's going on, even though it has never ever taken this link before. It's never taken, if that's, for example, I've said, right, we're going to go for a parent, then if I say, who is the grandchild, it will know who that is, even though it's never experienced this transition before, or in this particular family. And it's able to do that because it has seen many, many, many different family structures, many different families, but those families, of course, they might be different families, but they have the same family structure to them. And so it's able to learn that structure and generalize it to new situations. Okay, so that's sort of introduction to the model and sort of how it seems to work. This model does seem to generalize and learn some abstraction of what's going on, because it would not be able to do what I just showed you had it not learned that abstraction. So then the question is, of more interest to neuroscience, what are the representations that this model learns? What does it actually learn? Like, how is it solving these problems? Okay, so let's think about what might be the representations you would want to learn. Well, if you're wandering around on this graph, there's going to be sort of two pressures that you want for this blue abstracted representation. One's going to be that at each location that I'm at, I want to have a different representation, and so that I can make different memories. And then the second thing is this path integration. I want to be sure that when I return to the same location, I have the same representation as the last time I was there, so that I can retrieve the right memory. So those are the two pressures. I want different representations at every different place, but the same one when I return to the same place. Okay, and relating this a little bit to the anatomy of the hippocampal formation. So again, what we have is we have these blue abstract representations, these red sensory representations, and then these memory ones are going to be these sort of conjunctions. A cell here is now a little square. A cell is only active if it receives structural information and sensory information. Okay, and that's quite similar to what Tolman-Eichenbaum proposed in 2006, where they said that lateral entorhinal cortex is where sensory representation, well, I've sort of colored the boxes it badly, but okay, the red bit, lateral entorhinal cortex is where the sensory representations are. Medial entorhinal cortex is where these sort of relational representations are. And then in the hippocampus itself is where you get these conjunctions. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence after this sort of point of conjunctive representations in hippocampus. Okay, so let's start on this, looking at our representations, by having this machine just diffuse randomly around space. You know, it's just wandering around aimlessly, but you know, we're just giving it random actions. What's it gonna learn? Well, what we see in TEM, this is for these blue abstracted stuff, is we see things that look a lot like grid cells. And these are things that look like grid cells that come at different frequencies, so a high frequency and low frequency. You get different phases, they're shifted aside from each other. And you also get things a lot like band cells. And all of these properties are also observed in real cells in medial and trianal cortex. So that's quite interesting. We seem to be representing diffusive properties of the world in this sort of grid-like way. And so that's essentially saying that these grid-like things essentially represent the basic two-dimensional transition structure of space. For example, you can see this lovely paper by Kim Stackenfeld, which says that the eigenspectra of graphs look a lot like grid cells. Okay, then if we go and look inside our memory representations in our hippocampus, our TEM hippocampus, we see that we get, oh, I should have said, of course, that these things that I'm plotting here are just these rate maps, the same as what we saw in the first few slides, where this model is just wandering around the world, and then I'm just looking at the average activity at each node, and then there's a bit of smoothing. Okay. So you get a cell which will look like a place cell, and you get a cell which looks like a bigger place cell, and again, that's very similar to what you see in the observe in the brain as well. So that was diffusive behavior, but often animals don't just operate by diffusion. If you look at a rat, it likes to run around the walls. As I say that, unfortunately, I actually just see a rat outside my house. Okay, but anyway, you see a rat that runs along the walls, or rats that sort of like to approach shiny objects. Okay, so how might this change the optimal representations that you might learn in the Tolman-Eichenbaum machine? Well, because what I do in the world, whether I go near walls or go near objects, it really changes the transition probabilities of the environment now. So it should change the representations. And let's have a look what we find. So right here, these are two example cells. So now these white circles are objects in the environment. And we can see we have a cell which cares about being north always of this object. Wherever the object is, and so in this case, there's 4 objects in that environment, it always responds the same to each object. And likewise, here's another cell which always responds the same, but now to the east of each object, different cells. And interestingly, they don't just generalize to every object in the environment, but they also generalize across environments, so that every object in the new environment as well, and they behave the same way, whether it be firing to the right or firing to the above. And that's exactly like these object vector cells that we saw earlier, these cells that care about vectorial relationships to objects. And that's another interesting thing, because it sort of implies that this model, this machine, has factorized the implications of objects from that basic 2D structure of space. And so that's sort of interesting, because it means that now if I enter a world and the object's in a different place, I can infer what are the likely transitions to take around this object, even though I've never taken them yet. Okay, similarly, you can do exactly the same thing for borders, getting animals to run around borders. And you get these sort of cells which care about borders, and exactly what you see in the brain as well. In exactly the same way, it's factorized the implications of walls in the world, boundaries in the world. Again, it's factorized it away from the structure of space. And again, so I can now enter into new worlds with different shapes, and I can also infer what I'm likely to do. So that this whole sort of representations that you're learning are representations that are geared towards giving you generalization boosts, telling you how to do things in situations that you haven't seen before. Okay, so this is also pointing towards the sort of notion that the whole zoo of cells that we saw in entorhinal cortex, like grid cells, object vector cells, border cells, although they all sort of seen as their own different beasts, and they all sort of were a big famous paper when they came out, and they all look different when you actually look at their rate maps, perhaps there is like a common framework behind all of them. Perhaps they're all just about representing transitions in the world. And why do you want to do that? Because so you can optimize for making new inferences in new worlds. So hopefully this is some sort of like unifying framework for the different cell types that you find in these brain areas. Okay, so now let's have a look at what we see in the TEM hippocampus. So again, so in these non-diffusive behaviors, so in the case that we're heading towards objects the whole time, we can see that we get cells which seem to care about vectorial relationships to objects, but they don't generalize to every object in the world. So these ones care about the northeast, and these ones, well, mostly care about the north, but they don't generalize to every object in the environment. And that's exactly like these landmark cells that we saw in the hippocampus earlier. And we should, again, compare these to these hippocampal cells here to these entorhinal cells, where entorhinal cells generalize to every object because they care about transitions, and transitions around each object are the same, whereas these things, because they're conjunctions, they don't necessarily respond the same to each object. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about representations and so on, and we've spoken a little bit about generalization, but let's just wonder a little bit about how this generalization might actually be taking place, and what can we glean any sort of experimental predictions from that. So it's known that when you change environments, cells in hippocampus and entorhinal cortex remap, as in they change how they map the spaces in one environment to the other. So here's an example for hippocampal place cells, and you can see that two cells so each color here is the field of a place cell in this square environment. Of course, it's a schematic, but here you can see this orangey brown cell is firing next to the pink cell in one environment. But when we remap to the new environment, the orangey brown one's here and the pink one's not even active. So what this is saying is that there seems to be no relationship between how cells are coactive or active next to each other in one environment, active next to each other in the other environments. That's essentially like saying the correlation structure of the cells is not preserved from one environment to the other. They remap seemingly randomly. That's, however, not the same with entorhinal cortex. So if you look let's look at TEM here and what TEM does. We can see that a grid cell in one environment is a grid cell in the other. And also two cells that fire next to each other in one environment also fire next to each other in the other environment, even though they might have rotated and they might have been shifted around somewhere. But the cells retain their correlation structure. They stay on the same manifold as they were beforehand. And that's seen in TEM, not really shown here very well, but that's also observed in real data as well. These cells generalize. Okay, so then again, let's have a look at how TEM does remapping. So we can see that there's one cell in one world what is currently active in these locations. Then we go to a new world and it's active in a new one. It looks like it's remapped. Likewise, this bigger cell also looks like it's remapped. And again, that's exactly like what happens in the brain. So again, if you look at this and just look at all, it looks pretty random. But the question we can ask is actually, is it random? Well, if we remember what this machine says, is that it says that these hippocampal cells are a conjunction of both structural and sensory representations. That's kind of quite interesting, because although when I go between two worlds, this green world and this purpley pink world, although the sensory stuff might be different between the two worlds, so all the red stuff might be different between the two worlds, the structure is preserved. The blue, there is something that is preserved between the two representations, and therefore it implies there should be something that is preserved in the hippocampal representations between the two environments. And we're going to try and look for that. What are we going to look for? So what TEM is saying is that although it's very happy that place cells should remap, it's saying that when they remap in line, they preserve some relationship to grid cells. They have some relationship to the structure-y thing. So for example, a sort of a trivialized way of saying it would be saying that when this place cell is only active at a location where there's some sensory stimuli, but it's also receiving activity from a grid cell. So this cell was active when there is a coactive grid cell. And so when it remaps to a new place, the position that it remaps to has to be a position where this grid cell is also coactive. It's like saying it can only move to a new place in the environment where the grid cell has a peak. This makes quite a strong or firm prediction that if we're looking across the whole population of grid cells and place cells that are maybe recorded at the same time, it says that grid cell firing at the position of place cell peak, so the grid cell firing at this position in one environment, should be correlated with the grid cell firing at the position of the place cell peak in the other environment. We should find some correlation. Okay, so then we looked at two bits of data about this. So we have one from a remapping experiment done by Caswell-Barry, which has animals in one 1 meter by 1 meter box and then moves them to another 1 meter by 1 meter by box, and it simultaneously records grid cells and place cells. We can see we get some sort of non-zero correlation, and then if we run a big permutation test, it's come out very significant. And then we do sort of another interesting one from a more recent experiment, which is a remapping experiment, but where one of the environments is now spatial environments, just wandering, the rodent just wandering around a box, whereas the other experiment is actually a rodent, a head-fixed rodent running on a ball in virtual reality. But the virtual reality is still a box, but nevertheless, it's sort of comparing a spatial virtual reality world to a spatial world. And again, we see a correlation, and on permutation, it comes out significant. A bit of a silly point, but if you then look inside how TEM behaves under the same remapping analysis, it seems to behave quite similarly. Okay, so the last few moments, I'm going to describe a little bit about how what happens if we start representing slightly more complicated tasks. So the ones that we looked at the moment, you could say are a bit boring. You're just wandering around randomly, and in these sort of just simple structured worlds. But what happens if we start thinking about latent states and mixing spatial and non-spatial together? What might happen there? Okay, so let's consider this task where we're going to have a rodent. Well, this is in fact was actually a task, an experiment done in real life. But let's say we have a rodent running around this lap. It's going to be a circular, well, it's a square track, but it's essentially a loop. So it goes one loop, second loop, third loop, fourth loop. But the interesting point is, in fact, it just continues on doing many, many loops. But the interesting point is that every fourth loop it does, it receives a reward. So it receives, it has just received a reward, and then after it does these 4 loops, it receives another reward. And that's quite interesting, because there are sort of now 2 components to this task. There's one, the structure of the loop itself, and there's one, the structure of the task, which is 4 loops. Okay, so what would this TEM machine say about this? It would say, right, well, because we're in a loop, we need a lot of cells which care about space to be able to predict the upcoming sensory input. But because we're also in this 4 lap task, we also need cells which don't just know about space, but they sort of know about my position in the 4 lap task. They sort of, yeah, they sort of know about whether I'm in lap 1 or lap 3 or lap 2 or lap 4, etc. Because I want to be able to predict when I'm going to get reward as well. So there's sort of 2 components at play. I do need to represent space, but I also need to represent my position in task space. And this sort of makes some firm predictions about the types of cells that you'll see. So it says you'll see these spatial cells, cells that respond the same. It's lap 1, lap 2, lap 3. It's on cells that respond the same in each lap. So it's always responding here, always responding this location, always responding that location. This is hippocampal cells, sorry. But it says you're also, to represent where you are in the overall task, you need cells which care about which lap you're in. So this one cares about whether I'm in lap 1, this one cares about whether I'm in lap 2, and so on. And it also seems to say that you'll get these sort of cells which count. A little bit in lap 1, more active in lap 2, and then very active in lap 3. And so this exact experiment was done by Chen Sun from the Tonegawa lab, which is now just published in Nature Neuroscience last week. And if you look inside it, they find exactly these cells in hippocampus. You get cells which care about where I am in space, so care about spatial properties of the world, so always fire the same at each lap. You get cells which seem to know which lap you're in. So this cell only really fires in the first lap. And then you also get cells which sort of ramp their activity up. They sort of counting which lap I'm in. And that's exactly what TEM would say. You need this simultaneous representation of both where you are in space and where you are in task position. But you need both of those representations if you want to predict future events in the world. Okay, so one final a little analysis. So what we showed earlier with that simultaneous recordings of place and grid cells, we'd shown that remapping was not random. It was, in fact, place cells seem to preserve some information about grid cells after remapping. But one of the additional experiments that Chen Sun did in this 4 lap task that I just showed last slide was they also took the rodents out and they put them in a new a new environment, but they still were doing the 4 laps, but it was now a circular track, not a square track, and had different sensory things on it. But they were still doing the 4-lap task. So what they observed in blue, this is a distribution of spatial correlations in the world between the 2 different environments. So they saw that these hippocampal cells essentially, they should be going from -1 to 1. They do remap. So there's the spatial correlations aren't preserved, it's remapping. However, they have this other measure, which measures how the preference of laps of each of these cells, and that's in red, and it shows that a lot of these cells, even after remapping, and even after spatially remapping, they still care about where they are in that task space. They still code position in task space the same. And then if you do it exactly the same in TEM, that's what TEM says. It's not quite as neat and lovely, but it says that spatial stuff remaps, that's in blue, but these hippocampal cells still care about where they are in task space. So this is exactly the same thing as before. Hippocampus remaps, but it remaps still knowing something about the task structure. So hopefully what I've demonstrated there is that, and also Chen Sun and these other people demonstrated, is that hippocampus remaps, it builds a new map of the environment, but that map still retains knowledge about how the world works. And it retains that knowledge by receiving input from these abstractly location representations. Okay, so that's going to finish it up there. So what I've tried to go through in this talk is to say that relational reasoning and space are perhaps 2 sides of the same coin, and there's this graph-based formalism which sort of binds the 2 together. If you're able to abstract away relational information and represent it, those blue representations, it buys you these big gains in generalization. You can generalize immediately in new environments. We're saying that these entorhinal cells seem to be representing this abstract structure, at least for these sort of transition-based tasks. And then finally, we show that this sort of hippocampal remapping is in fact not random as previously thought, but it seems that relational structure is preserved. And here I want to thank you guys and also thank all these collaborators that worked on this as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for your interesting talk. Now we move to question and answer part. If any of the attendees has any questions, they can ask them in Q&A, or they can request for a voice permission so we can give them voice. We give you a few minutes, so there are no questions. So it seems we don't have any questions.
Okay by me.
Okay. Thank you for your interesting talk, and thank you for joining us today. With this, we now conclude this part of our symposium, and we move to the last part of the talk after a short break. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me here. Best of luck.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.